Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shortgen. I'm here with London Paul. And Paul, on the absolute day of the election that could really have some consequential changes, not just for the US, but for also European relations and, of course, Ukraine, I think it's time we go back and talk about the current state of what's going on in the Ukraine conflict. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this discussion. And what kind of updates have you heard on your side of the pond?
Yeah, well, firstly, obviously, thank you as well for joining me, Ken. It's always a pleasure when we can get together. Well, yeah, we'll park the US election discussion until we actually have a president, and then we'll see what the fallout is. I think at this point it's all very speculative and it doesn't really add any substance to anything. But clearly, and this is something we'll come on to later, there'll be a very different perspective in Europe and Ukraine with regards to the war if Trump's elected as opposed to Harris. But in terms of developments itself, I think it's good that we can just sort of bullet point things that are going on, important developments. And one of them I think was very telling is when Russia's representative to the UN, Nebenzia, came out and reiterated Russia's position. Because, of course, the West, in its desperation to somehow claim, well, not even a victory now. They're just trying to claim, let's call it a draw and pretend no one won. Previously, it was always, well, we're going to say we won and Russia lost. Now they know that, of course, Russia's won the war. They'll try and claim that it's a draw. And of course, Nabanzia came out and made it very clear, look, none of this is happening. There's not going to be any repeat of the Minsk agreements fiasco, clearly for obvious reasons. We're not going to freeze the front line, call some sort of quasi ceasefire. So, to coin his words, Zelensky can lick his wounds, or they can try and regroup in some capacity. And nor will Ukraine join NATO in any form whatsoever. And they reiterated all our goals of what they obviously term the special military operation, including demilitarization of Ukraine, remain in force. And quite simply, they are not changing in any capacity whatsoever. And another point they made is look, and we've said this before, the longer this war continues, and what is changing very rapidly is the amount of territory that Russia is seizing, particularly in Donetsk. I mean, it's an enormous amount of territory compared to any other point in the war. Conversely, of course, Ukraine is losing that territory. And they came out and said, look, we advise anyone who supports Ukraine to remember this and not give consideration to Zelensky's what he called clique, but about the Ukrainian people whose long-term interests have to lie in having peace and good neighborliness with Russia, and said, look, our Western colleagues are not doing a very good job in this regard. So I think that's the initial point where they're just laying the line in the sand very clearly. There's no negotiation. We're not going to be party to any of the games you think you can play once again. And I think initially that's a very telling statement.
Yeah, very much so. And one thing I noticed over the past, I would say 3 weeks, there have been two tranches of monies sent over by the Biden administration. They've been really quiet in the media. They're just, no longer front page. They're pretty much, the back of the publication. And I think that more than anything is either, hush money, just, be quiet. Don't come to the US. Don't start screaming, like a mad fool like you have been. But the other thing is as the election comes to pass, it's payoff for a number of these military industrial companies that this might be their last shot at getting them some money, especially Boeing. Boeing has just gone through the floor, and although that's a side issue, all of these industries that have been providing arms to Ukraine really it's kind of fascinating that one, it seems like, and I think this was already mentioned, many of the armaments were, old stock, nothing really new, nothing really of substance. Part of that, I think, was fear for what Russia was going to do, but it's also the fact that the U.S. is involved in so many different conflicts, what it's doing in the Middle East, partially in Africa, especially in Southeast Asia, that they really, after the first initial flooding of arms and money, they really can't afford, and while they can print the money out of thin air, it's the goods that Ukraine really wants, and they're just not getting. And it's kind of fascinating. Most of the rhetoric these days coming out of Ukraine, they haven't been talking about the incursions and where Russia is gaining ground, but they've been trying to do this side issue with North Korea soldiers are coming and we're going to kill them all and we're going to declare war on North Korea. It's, even the propaganda is so outrageous that nobody's even taking any consideration. And for the most part, you really don't see a lot of discussion about Ukraine much anymore on the social media platforms, in the media, or likewise. It's almost like the mindset in the West has been this war is over, and while we're not going to admit it and admit failure, we're just not going to talk about it and pretend that it goes away.
Yeah, absolutely. And for all the reasons we've highlighted previously, I think other points worth making is the whole demographic situation in Ukraine. It's highly difficult to understand what the population really is based on the fact of what's happening in the war, because the last census in Ukraine was actually conducted in 2001. Now, there's a lot of claims it's somewhere between 8 and 10 million people have left Ukraine. Now, a lot of those are refugees who've headed west into Poland and Germany, even the Netherlands, etc. And then, of course, there's all the ones who've headed east and are now in Russia with Russian passports and probably will never return. But what you can say is it's a demographic crisis. Absolutely. Never mind, of course, the very important point of just how many Ukrainians are being killed in the war or maimed to the point that they will never be able to fight again and arguably will not be able to have a full life in the future because of the injuries they've sustained. I mean, amputees is an obvious example, but there can be other very serious problems as well. So this is an enormous problem. And as the war reaches its conclusion, how many people will remain in what's left of Ukraine if they actually think this country's falling apart and it is economically, financially, politically. There's an enormous amount of scandal associated with the government, and therefore there will be people in certain regions who may not end up part of Russia, who will either just want to be part of Russia or leave, or maybe certain oblasts will seek to have a referendum, which may be a huge problem, to actually leave Ukraine. So Ukraine is going to have a monumental demographic crisis for all the reasons we've just stated in the future. And that's something that is now starting to gain a bit of prominence in discussions, because finally there's people in the West who are beginning to realize this is a huge problem. And obviously another point, we've said this before, but basically the front line in the contact points in Donetsk is just fallen apart completely. The situation is diabolical for the Ukrainian forces. I mean, and to do with like levels of mobilization have fallen, their ability to recruit people is falling. There's now calls to lower the conscription age to 18. But they are absolutely desperate, and the desperation is meaning we're still seeing insane recruitment of people in their 50s and arguably as old as 60. So that problem is not going to go away because Ukraine's losing enormous amounts of territory, resources, and most importantly, military personnel on the battlefield. the other thing is, and it's now, of course, the heating season, as it's called, and there's no doubt there's statements coming out, even from people within Ukraine, that the chances are they'll have blackouts for at least half the day, so at least 12 hours a day, could be as much as 20 hours a day. People are going to suffer in their homes because, yes, Russia has destroyed a huge amount of energy infrastructure. The other problem Ukraine has is they don't have enough gas reserves for the winter. Arguably, it's a bit debatable, but that's likely to be a problem. And of course, this situation's been aggravated because Western companies don't really want to pump gas into storage facilities that are under constant attack from Russian forces. And because of all the shelling, and we've talked about that previously, Ukraine's energy supply now relies mostly on nuclear power plants, but the deficiencies in their energy mix is well known. I mean, so that is a problem that's only going to get worse as well. And that might cause internal problems also within Ukraine itself. And one point I'll make, and then I'll give way to you, Ken, because I want to then talk about the desperation of Zelensky and why there is fear in the West that he may do something really, really reckless. But the point is that, and I think it's very telling, it's very clear, many NATO countries have long since given up any idea Ukraine's winning. Some of them still harbour some deluded idea that Ukraine can be a NATO member in the future. But Scholz, of all people, met the new UN Secretary General Rutte in Berlin, and he basically opposes any membership for Ukraine, basically ever, and said, we think there should be a neutral status for Ukraine, like Finland had for decades. Okay, that might be not quite the right analogy to use because Finland's now a member of NATO, but the point is Russia wants a neutral status that remains in place. So effectively, Scholz and Germany is agreeing to that, and they're not the only European country doing it within the NATO umbrella. And there's also talk of Germany wanting to set up a contact group with the Chinese, the Indians, and the Brazilians to negotiate some peace solution, note with Russia, not, well, Ukraine's got a peace plan and it doesn't involve any Russian input whatsoever. Doesn't mean Russia wants to be part of that discussion, but I would think that's more concrete than anything we've seen previously. So any idea that you have NATO memberships just means even the Germans realize there's no peace resolution. It's just not going to happen. I mean, and other nations can argue to the contrary, going, we have to respect Ukraine's choice and what they want. Well, no, absolutely not. Those days are over. And I think increasingly more and more European NATO countries are going, we just have to reach an agreement. This war has to end because we cannot continue to fund it. We can't continue to arm them. It's obvious the war's over. And the longer this war drags on politically, it becomes more and more of an embarrassment and potentially hugely politically damaging for those countries like Germans and like Scholz, who's been in office the entire time the war's on. People will say, well, you're to blame for this. You supported it. You should never have supported it. So they're beginning, if for no other reason than their own political futures, are now trying to think very differently. And I think that's a big shift, and even in the public mindset of NATO countries.
Yeah, and the fact of the matter is that back before the Maidan coup, Poroshenko running it, um, there was talk going on for at least 5 to 10 years about potentially bringing Ukraine into NATO. That talk was, and it was just shot down. They don't want Ukraine. They simply want Ukraine, in my opinion, the same way that they wanted Greece into the EU. Because you remember after the GFC, the great financial crisis, 2008, every Southern European, the pigs, they were so indebted, and the IMF and World Bank and the ECB, the Troika, were just forcing them to have to pay their debts, which they couldn't afford to do. And then all of a sudden, we're going to institute austerity. And here come the vultures in there to try to buy whatever assets are available. I remember a Forbes article. They're like, yeah, we're sitting there and the auction's going already, going, and we can pick this, pick this, pick this. I think they wanted Ukraine. The same reason that, we had agents in there. We have obviously some of the corporations that are in there. Uh, they want Ukraine for the assets and for, whatever guinea pig things, labs that they had, etc. They want Ukraine for that purpose. They don't want Ukraine as a full-fledged member with member rights into NATO or, for all intents and purposes, the EU. Ukraine was just another place on the border of Russia for them to pillage. And so if they didn't want them then, they sure as hell don't want them now that they've raised Russia's ire, and Russia is going to sit there like a hawk anytime you impose this. We're going to put pressure on you, and we're going to squeeze Ukraine till its head pops off. So I think that whole thing is out of there, and it's interesting that they're looking at trying to go around, talking with Moldova, and obviously maybe they're trying to get Georgia involved. But they've just moved on for the most part, they've moved on from Ukraine. And, as you're going to mention here in a little bit, Zelensky is trapped in a corner because he's really lost all allies. And when I use the term allies, I use it loosely. He no longer has those who are using him and using Ukraine and providing the support to do that. They've left. So he has no friends. He has no allies. He has little money. They have no arms, and they're sitting there with what remains of their population staring at, Game of Thrones, winter is coming. And with that being said, uh, you've got some thoughts that Zelensky, if he truly has cracked and gone off the deep end, rather than say his handlers and the rest of the government isn't threatening his life, he may do some desperate things in these final days, and obviously Russia has to be aware of that.
Well, yeah, the risk is not so much that he's going to do something with the blessing of the US, but in fact, quite the opposite. And I think there is fear within the ranks of the United States that it could indeed be the case. And that, again, people will go, I can't believe this is the case. Well, there's plenty of evidence to back this up. I mean, firstly, there's a lot of fear because Zelensky's talked about this, that they may try to go for a huge strike on Russian energy installations across wherever they can reach in the Russian Federation. They do this to provoke Russia into trying to raise the stakes of the war and turn it into a war as opposed to an SMO. And he thinks, well, if we do that, then this will force NATO to enter the war. I mean, and that's certainly something that could be a consideration. The other thing is, this is a bit of a wild suggestion, but and this has been sort of talked about for basically 2.5 years on and off, that Ukraine may be so desperate that it might try and then start a war against that thin strip of land, Transnistria, which would drag Moldova into the war indirectly. And then Russia would then have to respond accordingly. And bearing in mind it's landlocked by Odessa Oblast, then that would add a totally different dimension to the war. And therefore, if Russia raises the stakes again, because it would have to fight the conflict in Transnistria very differently. It's only got a small number of peacekeeping forces. There's also that ginormous munitions dump there that's supposed to be the biggest one in Europe. So it's a big problem. And again, that could cause an escalation. And if you're desperate, then the risk is that the Ukrainians might do something like that, or they could also try and evoke some other provocation that could cause, a huge disaster somewhere inside, whether it's a false flag inside Ukraine or maybe something inside Russia. Because obviously the question is, maybe Zelensky is running out of time because we've got the US election. And the argument is, if Trump wins, well, then Trump's going to basically, well, so he says, and we'll take him at his word. He wants to end the war immediately. And Zelensky knows this. So Zelensky's probably feels like he's running out of time. And maybe now he has run out of time. And this also explains all this discussion about North Korea and North Korean forces in Ukraine. Even though they're not in Ukraine, they're in Kursk, or they're supposed to be in Kursk. And that is a reason why then NATO forces have to join the war. And Zelensky's made a big song and dance about it. And no one in the West is interested. It's just going, I don't care. It's irrelevant, because they don't want to get involved, because, again, this risks an escalation that they're involved in. And the US has made it very clear that's never to happen, because then you risk World War III. But look at, some other very obvious statements. There was the aspect of his victory plan, Zelensky's, and one story that clearly got leaked by someone in the West. And of course, Zelensky was furious because it wasn't supposed to be in the public domain, but he wanted Tomahawks. Of course, the West went, you're not having them. I mean, you're not going to allow them to launch Storm Shadow missiles at targets deeper inside Russia, but then go, yeah, but you can have Tomahawks. But I mean, they were never going to give him those. But that's how desperate he is, that he wanted them. The other thing is, Zelensky constantly wants NATO forces in Ukraine. Okay, it's not going to happen, but it all adds up to the desperation. And then there are claims that he wanted to take control of the Kursk nuclear power plant as a bargaining tool. Again, that's an act of desperation. Then there was obviously the claim, well, there was never any intention of trying to really do anything with, we weren't trying to take Kursk. And when he tried to backtrack, because he realized the backlash from the West was enormous on this basis. And there's also the fear within, okay, and this is a Russian fear, but maybe the West feels this too, that they could launch some sort of provocation, Ukraine using the nuclear fuel, because it stores mostly Russian-made nuclear fuel. So it could try to do some provocation in order to discredit Russia, try and spread huge panic inside Russia, destabilize Russia. I mean, it's not going to work. But the risk is it could happen. So in a way, I won't quite use the word, but it's almost, Zelensky commits any of these actions, it could potentially escalate into a global conflict. And I don't think he particularly wants a global conflict, but he's so desperate in potentially causing this because of some of the things I've mentioned previously. I'm not saying they're all going to happen, but they're all things that are being discussed and considered to be a risk. And for me, that is a huge, huge problem that is still hanging over this whole conflict. It's one thing, Trump getting into office could change them, but it doesn't mean in that intervening period between now and January that Zelensky then gets even more desperate, because he knows that Trump's won the presidency and he knows his days are numbered. So no doubt the US is cognitively thinking about this as well, and aware of the risks that it poses, because it's one thing knowing the war's over and trying to find your own exit strategy, but Zelensky can be that desperate. There is a risk he could do something extremely foolish or dangerous that potentially could, I'm not saying necessarily escalate it to a global conflict, but you never know. There are potential risks. But I think the Russians and the Americans are fully aware of this, and they will have back channels to say, look, we need to be aware that this could potentially happen. But clearly, as the war grinds to its inevitable conclusion, how desperate could Zelensky get? And we can't say one way or the other, but we're just using this opportunity to say there are these risks, and hopefully none of those risks come to pass. But you have to be mindful that one of them might happen. and what are the consequences. And certainly the Russians, the Americans need to be fully aware of this because of the gravity of what one of those things could cause. Okay, the Kursk nuclear power plant's not going to happen now. It's impossible. He's not going to get Tomahawks. He's not going to get NATO forces in Ukraine. But the fact we've illustrated those is to show the desperation that Zelensky, or the situation from his perspective, is that desperate. And that's why he even made these suggestions of doing such actions or making such requests, particularly of the Americans.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I'm almost looking at the parallels of the tail end of World War One, when the Michael offensive, Germany just plowed through and they got within 30 kilometers of Paris. And so they pulled out their big Bertha gun and just started shelling Paris. There was no rhyme or reason for doing this. And within 6 months, the entire conflict was over. But what ended up happening is the psychological effect, this one desperate act. And for a couple decades after the war was over and the peace treaty and that, Germany kept pushing the belief that, well, they never got to Berlin, so we didn't lose. And since Russia really has no intention at this point of going to Kyiv, Zelensky can use that to push, hey, we didn't lose the war, they didn't take Kyiv. We ended this, or it ended, one of the two, and we still, we didn't lose, they didn't take over the country, they didn't take the capital, et cetera, et cetera. I wouldn't put it past Zelensky or anybody in that capacity, because ideology and propaganda are two very important things for the psyche of a populace. But inevitably, if Ukraine does not have the support, and that has waned immensely from the West, from NATO, from the EU, from the United States, then really it's just going to be, like a dog sitting on the porch yapping at their betters. It's going to, the Zelensky is going to be ignored, but inevitably, I think seeing what's going to come out of the election, whoever wins, is going to be important. And then, of course, what happens when we get into the middle of winter, January, February, if Kiev is to the point that, we've had enough, there might be some internal things that take care of the inevitability of the conflict altogether.
Yeah, so I think that's probably a good point to end today.
Exactly. Paul, as always, thank you for being a part of this great discussion and for your insight.
And likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you for all your support and all you've helped us to build. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, comment. Send this out to anybody you think it might be important. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.